Well, hello. Welcome to Sunday Coffee with Dr. Childress. So, today I'd like to discuss the family dynamics, looking to land hopefully on the child's experience, but we'll see how far I get. But just to describe what's happening, the family give you some sort of underlying understanding of what's going on. Um, to begin with, just within families, there are four types of relationship, and they depend on gender of the parent and gender of the child. Two of these relationships are cross gender relationships. Those are the high affection bonds. Excuse me. Those are mother, son, father, daughter. And then two are same gender bonds. Those are the values and identity bonds. That's father, son, and mother, daughter. And so, how this pathology impacts the family and how it works depends to a certain degree on which one of those relationships is the primary pathology located in, which one of those children or relationship children is the parent using as their regulatory object. And typically that's the oldest child because the pathological parent, narcissistic, borderline, dark personality parent, only needs one regulatory object. So during the marriage, that was you. And so you were the regulatory object for the disorganization and psychological issues for the other parent, spouse. But once you leave, stop serving that role, it activates their attachment networks again and all the trauma that's within them, losing an attachment bond, the spousal attachment bond. And so they seek to stabilize themselves by incorporating a child into the triangle, into the spousal conflict as a regulatory object. And they only need one, and typically it's the oldest one. Now, what happens with the other, if there's younger siblings, is that the pathological parent will grab the eldest child into a coalition. And then once that's stable, the splitting dynamic where things have to be on one side or the other, and black or white thinking, will move and capture the other children. The eldest child will serve as to also bring them into the alliance and into the coalition. So eventually all the children will be on one side, but it starts with one, and typically it's the eldest. And how it manifests, or the features of it, will depend in part on which one of those four relationships the child has with the pathological parent. Are they on the cross gender relationship, and which one, and or are they on the same gender relationship, and which one? Now, the overall pathology itself has two broad categories. One is a narcissistic, more of a narcissistic display. Typically, that's a narcissistic dad and the targeted parent mom. Those have a higher spousal abuse feel to them when the father is the pathological parent. On the other side is the borderline mom spectrum, and that's typically the targeted parent dad. And those have a higher anxiety and false allegations component to them. This is broadly speaking, but um, though it tends to fall into those two categories. And then we have the addition of the dark personalities kind of fluttering in the background. The relevance of the dark personalities is in the Machiavellian manipulation trait. And so if you get a dark personality, you're going to get extraordinary manipulation, and it's the factitious disorder becomes a more prominent diagnosis for secondary gain of manipulating the courts. They're all doing it. They're all manipulating. Narcissistic, borderline, immensely manipulative people, but dark personalities are even more manipulative. And if you get the sadism on that, you can get the dark tetrad. And so it's the sadism and manipulation component that's relevant to the dark personality. But broadly speaking, you're going to have a narcissistic display, which has a higher spousal abuse feel to it, typically the pathological father, targeted parent mom, or the borderline personality display with a borderline mom, targeted parent dad, that has higher spousal or has higher allegations of abuse and anxiety associated with it. Now, narcissistic and borderline personality pathology are actually flip sides of the same sort of attachment trauma. It's just expressed differently in the two. And at a core, this is attachment pathology, and it's being driven by problems in the attachment system of the pathological parent. Specifically, the problem is they are unable to manage or process grief, sadness, the emotion of sadness. And whenever there's sadness, like separation, grief, and loss, they lock up into anger and other things because their attachment system doesn't work as it should. But now, when I'm looking at a family, when I'm entering a family situation and kind of orienting to where we are, the first thing I want to know is how many kids are there? Are we dealing with one child or multiple children? Also, when was the divorce event? Are we in the early phases of this or are we in the later phases of this? Because that's going to be another variable factor. Basically, I kind of see this as in three phases of development of the pathology. It'll keep getting worse. It's a degenerative pathogen. The initial phase is the early entry parents, and they thought they were just getting a divorce. You thought you were just getting a divorce, and then you'd go on to a post-divorce family. You didn't anticipate all the chaos and conflict that was going to emerge. Is certainly not the children being twisted and distorted in their relationship to you. And so it's very disorienting and destabilizing for the early entry parents. And many of them begin to search the internet, run across the parental alienation thing, and move into that and say, oh, that's what I have. Don't do that. Don't use parental alienation. It just take you down a problematic road. There's no such thing. Stay over in established constructs. What you want to use instead, probably instead of the term parental alienation, is the concept of psychological control of the child. There's a whole bunch of research if you use the term psychological control. If you use the term parental alienation, you're just going to go into a world of controversy and conflict, and it's just not a good place to be. So you want to use psychological control or cross-generational coalition. That the coalition between the allied parent and the child against the targeted parent. Use Minuchin's diagram regarding that, nice little triangle, and shows the cutoff and everything. And that'll keep you grounded in family systems therapy, real knowledge. You get the advantage of the inverted hierarchy once you start using family system stuff, which is the child judging down at the parent. The child is judging the parent as if the parent were the child and the child were the parent. It's an inverted hierarchy. And in Minuchin's diagram, you'll see that because the son is up on the parental level with the father, and the mother is on the child level beneath that. And that's the hierarchy sort of status of things. And so if you use cross-generational coalition, you get the additional construct of an inverted hierarchy, plus enmeshment, plus emotional cutoff, all sorts of wonderful things if you stay grounded in actual stuff. But these early entry parents are coming in. The pathology has specific code within it, within its source code. It has specific, I call them meme structures, that are designed to destabilize you in every way possible. So that's going to destabilize you financially, it's going to destabilize you emotionally, just psychologically. Your very fundamental role as mom or dad is going to be taken from you or threatened. And all of that is designed to produce fear in you. So you respond out of fear and you become reactive to situations. What is of benefit for these early entry families is to acquire knowledge, relax, and don't get triggered into your fears. Dorsey's higher purpose parenting course is really good for that. So I recommend if you're an early entry parent, medium entry parent, with relatively school age kids or adolescent kids still actively going on, Dorsey's higher purpose parenting class would be a good place to start, to get ground and get stable on where you are, because the pathology is going to try to destabilize you. The other feature about the pathogen is it's going to want to drive this into the court system to make this about possession of the child, and make it about custody, and that way they'll put you on trial to prove that you deserve to be a parent. Basically, psychologically, they're putting you on trial for being a bad spouse and for disappointing them. I'll show you for divorcing me. But it's being manifested of putting you on trial for being a deserving parent. That's the associate clinical sign. You don't deserve to have a child because of some horrible thing that they allege. And so that's and also by driving it into the courts, it's going to make it as expensive and as hard, because courts delay a lot of stuff, and so it's going to make it expensive and hard for you to see your children, as hard as possible. And ultimately, it's going to try to drain you of your finances so you can't fight back. What you want to do, especially if you're an early entry parent, is you want to get it over into treatment, into the healthcare system. You want a treatment plan. That's Dr. Childress in clinical psychology, and it's a differential diagnosis. Either it's child abuse by you, so let's rule that out. Those are the allegations. Or it's psychological child abuse and a shared persecutory delusion of the allied parent. So it's going to go one way or the other. So let's get a differential diagnosis appropriate to each parent, and see what's going on. Is it a two-person attribution of causality? That means you're causing the child's attachment problems. Or is it a three-person triangle attribution of causality, like Mnuchin, where it's a cross-generational coalition with the other parent that's creating the pathology with you? That's the diagnostic question you want answered. Two-person or three-person? Are you being abusive, or is the allied parent psychologically abusing the child? The healthcare system is a lot less expensive. You want to avoid forensic custody evaluations because they don't diagnose pathology. They're just 7-8 months of delay, that God knows why they come up with what they do. And it's just one person's personal opinion. They apply no knowledge, and they don't give you a diagnosis. And that's exactly what we need. So even after a forensic custody evaluation, we still need a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse. So it's pointless. Why did we waste, $20,000, $40,000 for a custody evaluation that took 6 to 9 months when we still need a diagnostic assessment? Is there a shared persecutory delusion? That's the critical feature. And what the pathology is trying to do is put you on the defensive. And so it throws out a bunch of attacks and attacks you on everything, and it wants you to defend yourself. Because as long as you're defending your parenting, the focus is on you as being the problem, not on them. So they're keeping the lights off of them by keeping the focus onto you. So one of the important features about responding to this is not to get defensive. Don't trigger into your fears. Don't get defensive. But stay on the attack, which is, well, you're accusing me of somehow abusing the child. I'm saying it's a persecutory delusion. So now we need to assess whether it's a persecutory delusion. Keep the focus on them as to whether this is a true or false belief, or whether it's a persecutory delusion. So that's why I developed the parenting practices rating scale. It's up on my website. It's part of the assessment protocol that I recommend. Diagnostic checklist, parenting practices rating scale for the targeted parent, is to document clearly on that scale in 1 to 4 levels, what's your parenting? Are you a problem parent? And if so, levels 1 or 2, tell us what it is, we'll fix it, and that should fix the problem. But you're not. You're a level 3, at worst, you're level 3 normal range problematic, and probably your normal range, level 4 parent, in which case you cannot be causing that child's attachment pathology. That's a rejection of a parent only can possibly happen with abuse. Doesn't really even then, but still, normal problematic parenting produces what's called an insecure attachment, more strongly motivates the child to bond to the parent. It doesn't produce rejection. That's a child abuse range. And if you're not child abuse range, boop, it's the other parent and it's a persecutory delusion. So the first thing we need to identify is it's a false belief that they are being malevolently treated in some way by you. And once we get it, it's a false belief. How false? Is it a persecutory delusion? And you keep the focus over on them and you make it about treatment to fix things. The other thing that you do when you make it about treatment is you claim the narrative. Right now, they're trying to claim the narrative of a pattern. Abusive parent, victimized child, protective parent. That's a particular pattern of child abuse that's locked into their attachment networks. So when their attachment networks activate around the divorce, that pattern gets put onto the current situation, and that's the delusion. You're not an abusive parent, there's no victimized child, and they're not the protective parent. But that's what the storyline, the narrative that they're trying to construct, the trauma reenactment narrative. And you need to move this into a different narrative. Make this about treatment. And because the pathology fights about everything, honest to God, the pathology fights about everything. It's so predictable. So use that. So you position yourself on treatment. It will then argue, no, 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 we don't need treatment. We just need this parent to be gone. And that exposes the pathology. And everybody goes, wait a minute, let's fix this. This is a child. This is attachment bond. Mom or dad, let's fix it. So, so you want to make this about treatment. It's going to try to make it about custody. It's going to try to activate you into your fears. You need to stay calm and start planning ahead and anticipate where you're going to be in a while. Don't go down the road of parental alienation. Stay in established constructs and get a treatment plan. That's all you need to kind of focus on. I want a treatment plan to fix it. I want a treatment plan to fix it, because treatment requires diagnosis, and you're over in the healthcare system rather than the legal system on this. Now, so the first kind of things I will look at is how many kids are involved, when was the divorce event, so we have the early entry parents. Then we have the parents who've been here for a while, and so you're locked into the custody battle for a couple of years now. Things have deteriorated a lot over the time frame. You might be on some unwarranted supervised visitation. You might have handled false allegations through CPS investigations. You've been here for a little bit of time, but you still have children in the range of children. And so for that, for the early entry parents, we're trying to deal with early intervention and prevention of it getting worse. With the mid-range parents, we need to do a course correction, typically on the mental health people. You might have a forensic custody evaluation come through. That's a lot of my practice right now, is reviewing those and kind of trying to get a course correction on the diagnosis or diagnostic issues. And we need to get you out of the primary thing. We need to get you out of the family courts and over into treatment. The family courts is the worst place to be, and it's immensely expensive. We need to be bringing down the costs of this substantially. The driving it into the legal system is a form of spousal abuse. It's financial spousal abuse, making it so financially hard to see your child. And it's related to the spousal emotional and psychological abuse of what they're doing with the kid. So there's actually two dangerous pathologies involved. Um, Child psychological abuse, which I focus on because that's the leverage point. We need to protect the child. Um, in addition, though, there's also a spousal abuse diagnosis, V995.82, spouse or partner abuse psychological, that is warranted. They're using the child as a weapon of spousal abuse, and in weaponizing the child as a spousal abuse weapon, they're creating such significant pathology in the child that becomes child abuse. So, it is at its core, this is a spousal abuse issued, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, IPV. And notice how tricky the pathogen is with this too. It says, "Oh, it's not about you, it's about the child. Don't make this about." No, it's all about you. And it's taking away your ability to go, "Ow, this hurts." And he said, "It's not about you, it's about the child." No, it's about you. It's spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. But this pathology is immensely manipulative. So everything about it's a lie. This is a pathology of lies. Every single thing about this pathology in the family courts is a lie. And so it's pretty impressive. Um, and so the middle range people, we need to get you out of the courts and we need to get you over into healthcare. We need to get a diagnosis. We may not be able to, the oldest child may be lost because they're turning 18 or maybe have already turned 18, but we still have some of the younger kids potentially that are still available for recovery. Um, then we have the third group, which is the now adult children, um, where they've aged out of any sort of court control, and yet there's still that emotional cutoff, there's still that breach. And for these kids, for the now adult children, I'll be focusing them later. I'm kind of attending at this point, but more actively on changing the mental health system right now. But I would recommend you get over to Dorsey. She has a program, Reunited, which is a parenting course that sort of builds on higher purpose parenting skills. But she's the only one that over here that I know of that has any sort of approach for recovering now adult children, and it's an effective approach. She'll help with that. Um, and so let me, as I get into the children, there's kind of a domain, there are kind of a range of child experiences here that depend on the phase of the pathology. In addition, so first, am I dealing with narcissistic borderline pattern potentially? When was the divorce event? What phase am I in? But then my next concern or my next issue is I'll look to the eldest child, the one who's being used as a regulatory object, um, and and look at which one of those four relationship patterns they fall into. Are they cross gender, same gender, and then which one? And so let me talk about each one of those four and how it impacts, how this pathology impacts each one of those. And so I'll be looking at the allied parent and the oldest child and the gender of each. So let's start with the cross gender ones. Those are the high affection bonds. So we have a allied parent dad with a female child, a daughter. Okay, so there's your cross gender relationship, and he's captivated her into a cross generational coalition against the mother. This is a very disturbing pattern because it's a special relationship between the father and the daughter that excludes the mother. That's the incest pattern. And it's incest pattern on the other cross gender one as well. But it's more pronounced on this one, the incest pattern, a special relationship between the father and the daughter that excludes the balancing influence of the mother. In that pattern, whenever clinical psychology sees that, it's the treatment becomes to get the mom involved as a balancing influence because that's not a healthy relationship pattern for the daughter. She's replacing the father in the role she's replacing the mother in the role affections with the father, and that's kind of creepy. So that's one pattern. The and the father is basically in that pattern. The dad is likely a narcissistic dad. There's no empathy. There's an emptiness inside of the narcissist, and he's using that emptiness and the high affection bond to manipulate the child, because the child is, that daughter, that young girl is so wanting her father's love and affection, but it's not there. There's no love and affection there. It's anorexic on that high affection channel, but he will give affection if she collapses to his desire to for her to reject her mom. So the price she has to pay for his love is the rejection of mom, which is all that creepy psychological incest stuff. There's With this pathology, there's not a concern that he's actually physically abusing her, but it's the psychological. It's a ripple from a generation or two before. It's the same patterns that are filtering through across generations. So that's a very disturbing pattern to see as a cross-gender father-daughter alliance. The other cross-gender one is the other high affection bond is the mother-son bond. And here the mother is again using her high affection bond with the son. In this case, she's turning her son into a warrior against his own father. And so he's, got his mother's favors on his lance, and he's going off to fight his father on his mother's behalf as her um, guardian and savior. Well, that's creepy too, because he's basically defeating his father for his mom's affections, which is the Oedipal thing. And if he wins, that's going to be psychologically difficult for him. He's now defeated his father for his mother's special affection, um, and that's going to impact the values and identity kind of thing that should be coming from the father-son bond. Or the father has to defeat him relative to the challenge, in which case he crushes his son's emergence as a young man. So either way, that's a very destructive thing to do to that young man, is to make him a warrior against his own father by putting him in the middle of the situation. So both of those cross-gender um, expressions of the pathogen, when it hits on those two relationships, have that incest Oedipal kind of underlying undercurrent to it, because the pathology itself is the transgenerational transmission of sex abuse trauma. So it's rippling sex abuse, and so a lot of the patterns and a lot of the themes of that original sex abuse are still contained within the pathology. And here you have it real clear on the cross-gender ones. When we switch over to the same gender pathology, so we have a father and a son against the mother, or a mother and a daughter against the father. For the father-son against the mother, that's going to have a high spousal abuse feel to it. The father is weaponizing his son, and when the son is an adolescent or something like that, I'll see symptoms where the mother is calling the police because she feels threatened by her son, by her adolescent son. Anytime I see parents calling the police, that is not normal, and we're into some version of weaponizing the child in spousal abuse. But the father-son, and the father-son is on the values and identity bond, and the narcissistic value that all of them teach their child, because all of them narcissistic, is that it's okay to be cruel to somebody if they deserve it. And so when they say and do cruel things to their mom, in this case, I would challenge that in my assessment or therapy. I'll say, wow, that's a cruel thing to say, because I'm doing a little assessment on that to see their response. Because the absence of empathy is a capacity for cruelty. And so when they say something cruel or do something cruel, I'll put that out there that that's a cruel thing to say. Oftentimes I'll use the word mean. I can say, wow, that's a mean thing to say, because that's a little bit more inflammatory, triggers up their response, because I want to see if they have empathy networks that are still active, or whether I get typical response, which is, but she deserves it. So that's a cruel thing to say. She deserves it because of XYZ. That's the spousal abuse theme. Yeah, of course I hit her, but she deserved it. My dinner was cold. Yeah, I smacked her around, but she deserved it. She was talking back to me. She deserved it. Okay. And so that's the spousal abuse theme, and it's one of the associated clinical signs that the parent deserves the cruelty because of something they did in the past. The actual true value system is that we're not nice to other people because of who they are. We're nice because of who we are. So we're not mean to the kid with autism in the class because they're annoying. We understand, we have empathy, and we kind of cope with it differently than being cruel. And so that's the value system that should be taught to that young man. Proper respect for women, proper respect for his mother. You don't treat her that way, not because she doesn't deserve it, but because that's not who you are. You don't treat and say those things or do those things to your mom. But that's not the values the son's being taught. He's being taught to, it's okay to be cruel if mom deserves it, and then we just have to figure out the reason why mom deserves it. She was to blame for the divorce, or she was too controlling, or just it's Tuesday and whatever. There's insubstantial reasons, but they generate them um, for cover, basically, for the narrative. Um, Delusional disorder starts with the conclusion as fixed and then constructs the evidence to match the fixed and false belief. And so, um, like example, the big lie, Donald Trump losing the election. It starts with the belief that Donald Trump won, so the votes don't line up, so therefore there must be election fraud. And so they construct the evidence, or try to, based on the fixed and false belief. And so the fixed and false belief here is that the targeted parent deserves to be rejected, and now the child and everybody has to construct the reasons why, and that's why they are so ephemeral, and there's no there when you actually look at the reasons. They just deserve to be rejected because of something, which is a spousal abuse field. So the father-son alliance against the mother is a high spousal abuse one, using the child as a weapon. Potential police calls, that gets a little disturbing when those are involved. And uh, well, okay, so that's a higher spousal abuse field to it. Oh, when there's that's also a concern I look for with that, for the psychopath. So it's not only the narcissist, it's the psychopathy, the psychopathic combination, narcissistic psychopath, which is the dark triad, Machiavellian manipulation. Oh my goodness, when we get a dark triad father with a son, that the spousal abuse concerns go up considerably, and the diagnosis is most likely warranted. Child psychological abuse, spousal abuse, um, psychological using the child as a weapon. The other same gender bond is the mother daughter against the father. And that's going to likely have a strong borderline component to it, and potentially the more active sex abuse themes coming through, where the mother is protecting the daughter, and there's going to be allegations around that. Especially if the daughter is just coming into adolescence, 12, 13, 14, that you might get, or even 10, the allegations or the implications of sexual abuse danger. And they're very um, subtle in implications that are thrown out there, that something's dangerous about you, and the child will say, I feel uncomfortable with dad's affection. That's just like hugging his daughter, or just saying, hi sweetie. And oh, it makes me feel uncomfortable. So that word, uncomfortable, when a child says My dad's affections make me feel uncomfortable, and there's no sex abuse allegation in this situation. It's just that it's we got the pathology. We got a borderline mom doing this with the daughter. Um, and so that's going to have that higher component. The big concern on all big concern on the father-daughter relationship is the cross-gender one. So the targeted parent is on the high affection bond, and it's the same true with the mother-son. She's on the high affection bond with the child, but the child's getting no affection. But it's especially glaring to me in this one, where we have a father-daughter high affection cross-gender bond, and the daughter's getting zero affection from her dad because she thinks she's rejecting it. She's because of mom's influence. That's destroying half of her attachment networks. Her whole father-daughter attachment system networks patterns are just a terrain wreck. And that's what people I would encourage you to begin to understand is that the attachment system has kind of two zones, one for the mother and one for the father. So for a young daughter, she has half of her attachment system is set up to acquire mom-daughter kind of patterns and networks. The other half is set up to acquire the cross-gender father-daughter attack. And they're different. And if we can't just take one out and say, oh, well, if we have to, if some parent dies or something, or they're alcoholic. But holy cow, we want both of those, and we want them both healthy to develop a healthy child. So that's, again, where if you stay away from these parental alienation stuff and stay with real pathology, call it an attachment pathology. That's the love and bonding system of the brain, is the attachment system. And child rejecting a parent is an attachment pathology. It's the worst possible attachment pathology, a complete breach in the parent. It's not like it's a bad relationship. There's no relationship. That's anorexia for a primary motivational system of the brain. Eating system is primary motivational system of the brain. No food, anorexia. Attachment system, primary motivational system of the brain for love and bonding. No love and bonding. That's anorexia. The attachment system is getting devastated. So with that, that's the issue is we need to get that affection flowing back in from the parent to the child on all of these. But I'm just aware, particularly on the cross-gender ones, we need that affection going back into the child. On the same gender, where the father and son against the mother, when that mother, the no affection is getting to that son relative to his mother on the high affection bond, that's going to produce devastating consequences for his next wife. When he grows up, he's going to have mommy issues for 20 years because he's not getting that fundamental mommy love that children want. Little boys want their mom to love them. Little girls want their mom to love them and dad to love. And so it's devastating for the child. But one of the things as I approach into explaining what the child's experience is to simply understand that all relationships are unique and that there are 4 different patterns here that we're dealing with dependent on gender. And so it's going to take a little bit of a different flavor to it based on whether we're more narcissistic or more borderline, and then the genders of everybody involved. Now, again, the pathological parent needs one regulatory object. They will select the oldest child typically, and then move to the younger children with the supportive influence of the eldest child, and till everybody's over on that side. We want to interrupt that as soon as possible, and sometimes we're not able to get in there soon enough on it. We have the eldest child maybe reaching that 18 age or 16, where the courts begin to say, well, we should consider what the child wants. No, not if it's child abuse. Yeah, no, but they don't recognize that yet. So there's sometimes they make a suggestion, or people will make a suggestion when they recognize what's going on, to say, well, we'll save the younger kids, but the oldest kid we're not going to separate because it would be too flamboyant and too difficult, or seemingly too difficult. No, 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 no. If we never abandon one child to save the rest, that would have tremendously damaging psychological consequences for the eldest child. Why did you save my siblings and why didn't you save me? And so once they come to awareness in the 30, 40, whatever, it's not good to abandon any child to child abuse. So diagnosis guides treatment. If it's child abuse, we protect the child 100% of the time. So the question is there child abuse? And we don't divide things up. Each of those parents is unique to the child, and their relationship is unique to the child. There's not one better parent or one worse parent, and we're kind of dividing up 75%. No. In the absence of child abuse, parents have the right to parent according to their cultural values, personal values, and religious values. So if there's no child abuse, get out of the way. Parents have a right to parent. Stop micromanaging them. In addition, if there's no child abuse, each parent should have as much time and involvement with the child as possible. Generally, that works out to 50-50 unless there's school districts or something involved, and one parent becomes school week parent, the other one every other weekend parent. Those are basically the only two custody schedules, roughly 50-50, where you either do it, mix it week, 3 days, 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, or you week on, week off. That's one type. Or every other weekend and the night during the week, and once parent gets the school week privacy. We don't need a 7-month custody evaluation to make a selection between those two options. But give them the most possible. If there's concerns around child abuse or problematic parenting, let's get a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse to the appropriate differential diagnosis for each parent. So is the targeted parent abusive, or is the Elida parent abusive? Psychologically abusive. Let's get a proper risk assessment for that. So shifting a little bit here. So those are structural patterns. The pathology itself, at its core, at its deep, deep core, is the inability of the pathological parent to process the emotion of sadness. Sadness is processed through the attachment networks. So the child, falls and scrapes their knee. They go running back to mommy, hop in her lap. She goes into this sort of rhythmic rocking and says, "Oh, sweetie," nice tones, and helps the child re-regulate and helps the child soothe the child. And what that is there's the brains connect, mirror neurons and various rhythmic things. Brains connect with each other and form a dyadic brain. It's called intersubjectivity. Tronic calls it a dyadic state of consciousness. That it's a oneness of the two brain systems. And when the child comes back or when the child falls, the brain goes into a disorganized state because of the pain and stuff, and they start to disorganize behavior. They're crying, their respiration is disorganized, their emotions, behavior, everything's disorganized because of the pain. So then they motivates them to come back and seek the nurture from the parent. And then the parent, though, goes into a nice rhythmic state of, soothing and nice calming. And the child's in a disorganized state. And the child imports into their own brain networks, into their mommy networks or daddy networks, that rhythmic of the parent. And that helps the child then organize their own brain networks to the rhythms that are being imported from the psychologically organized parent. That's how things are supposed to work. So sadness, the emotion of sadness, prompts the child to seek nurture, and the parent helps the child regulate that sadness through the bonding. What happens with the narcissistic borderline dark personality, with personality pathology, is it's an attachment trauma, complex trauma, where the parent never soothed them out of that sadness. So they don't have the capacity to regulate sadness because of the breached attachment bond. No one ever helped them process that emotion. So when they get married, you're an attachment figure. The spouse is the attachment figure. They have idealized, or you're going to be wonderful for me, but then you're going to fail in some way because you're the failed mommy or daddy from their own childhood. They're going to set up the experience that you are inadequate to regulating them, keeping them regulated, the perfect regulatory object for their um, chaos inside, for their self-structure damage is what it's called. And so you're the regulatory object for that. You're supposed to be the all wonderful healing mommy or the all nurturing loving daddy, and you're not. And so then all of a sudden you become the all evil one, the abusive mom or the abusive dad from their own childhood process. They're reenacting their trauma out. So we get that breach then, the divorce. That's it. I can't handle it. Boom, we're divorced. The attachment system, those brain networks, is the brain system that guides all aspects of love and bonding throughout the life, including grief and loss. So when the sadness comes, grief and loss about a breached attachment bond, the narcissistic borderline pathological parent cannot process that emotion of sadness and grief surrounding the breached attachment bond. And instead, they turn it into anger and resentment loaded with revengeful wishes. That's a quote from Kernberg. So instead of feeling the ability to feel this mournful longing for the lost relationship, they turn it into anger and resentment loaded with revengeful wishes. And so that's what we're seeing out of the pathological parent, the desire for revenge and the anger, and then they're using the child as a means to get that revenge and as expression of the anger. You deserve to suffer, and so I'm going to get the child to do that. So that at its core is the pathology. There's a quote from Bowlby that talks about that, a little short one. The activation of attachment is due to pathological mourning, disordered mourning, and then links over to Kernberg quote, transitioning, and then borderlines are known in the research. They don't deal well with sadness. They can't mentalize it, it's called. They don't experience it. It goes into anger and resentment. And this is important to understand. I won't get too far into the child's experience, but it's important to understand how the child is captivated, because the child is a normal human. Their brain is normal. The parent, the pathological parent, their brain is not normal. There's damage in the attachment networks, specifically around identity and empathy. Networks are pretty messed up, and sadness is just a train wreck. So what happens for the child is the divorce creates both anxiety and sadness. Anxiety because what's going to happen here? This is a change, and so their body activates them into trying to understand, what's this mean? That now the parents are getting divorced. What does that mean? So we're going to get a little bit of arousal, anxiety, and also those sadness, because they're losing something. Anytime you breach, there's going to be grief, so you lose your favorite sweater, you're going to grieve the loss of your sweater. Boop. And so they're losing the intact family that they've known. So there's going to be just natural grief regarding the loss of the intact family. And then they're not seeing their parents quite as much, one or the other, and stuff. And so they're mourning the loss of relationships. There's going to be a natural sadness and grief associated with the breach. And it's going to happen anytime there's a divorce, all divorces, 100% of the time. What the pathological parent does, because they can't process sadness, is they will come into the child and get the child to misattribute the cause of their feelings. So the child's anxiety about what's going to happen under the distorting influence of the pathological parent becomes, you're afraid of the other parent. There's something dangerous about that other parent, and they inflame it. And the child goes, is that true? Maybe it is. Is that why I'm feeling so anxious when I'm going over it? Because I'm worried? No, you're anxious because of all the stress around the situation. You're anxious about what's going to happen in the situation, and you're excited about seeing your parent. That excitement and anxiety are really close together. The difference between excitement and anxiety is a smile. If you're anxious and you smile, you've changed the emotions into anxiety. You have the or in excitement. If you have anxiety brain chemicals up here, you smile, you also have happy chemicals. Happy and anxious is excitement, your roller coaster. Woohoo, this is fun, but it's scary. So so it's a misattribution of the child's normal range, anxiety, arousal, and under the distorting influence, they get false beliefs that there's some sort of danger involved. It's with the sadness, though, that it's the most nastiest of the twisted misattributions, because the child is sad. The pathological parent will come in and attribute that to something problematic that the other parent, the targeted parent, is doing. The reason you're hurting is because they caused the divorce. They're to blame for the divorce. And so they're the ones causing your pain. Blame. Or they'll something about your parent. Yeah, mom's just so controlling. I know exactly how she gets. They get the child to believe that it's something bad about the targeted parent that's causing the child's pain. So that's an important piece that I'll be wrapping up here with today, in understanding the child. Your child has authentic anxieties and authentic sadness and pain. It's just not for the reason they think. It's just because there's a breached attachment bond. That's one of the reasons I think Dorsey can get this recoveries relatively easy, because once we get that bond back together, the child goes, holy cow, I'm not hurting because they're a problem. I was hurting because I wasn't bonded to them. Or, oh my gosh, there's nothing to be worried about. That was just because I was, the situation is unusual and different for me. So once we give the child a proper attribution for their feelings, they kind of stabilize out pretty well and pretty good. The attachment system is a primary motivational system of the brain. It wants to do its job and bond. We just need to get some of the barriers out of the way. But part of the importance of this is, if you say to your child, you don't really feel that way, or trying to convince your child that they don't feel the way they do, or that they're being manipulated, their feelings are being manipulated, the child will go, no, 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 you don't getting it. These are my feelings. I authentically feel this way. Well, yeah, they do. They authentically feel sad and hurt, and they authentically feel anxious and aroused, but not for the reasons they think they do. Okay, it's because of the breached attachment bond. That's simple as that. And so helping the child develop a more accurate attribution of causality for their feelings is part of the treatment, and that has to do with narcissists and borderlines are not self-aware of their inner experience. Attribute causality kind of in a distorted way, the persecutory delusion of the situation. And the other feature that's a little bit associated with this is, don't try to convince your child by thinking. The Trauma is the absence of empathy, and the absence of empathy is complex trauma. It's the same thing. And so the living with a narcissist is traumatic, and this whole situation is complex trauma for them. The absence of empathy from the pathological parent. The treatment for that is abundant empathy. So anytime you're asking the child to understand your point of view, empathy's flowing in the wrong direction. You want us to keep empathy going that direction and bring the lantern of your eyes of the other to their inner and help them understand more about their attribution of sadness. Yes, they feel sad, but is it just because it's sad? It's sad. The divorce is sad. You're losing me. I'm sad. I'm sad. And how do we handle sadness? And we get hugs. We don't attack people. That's a pathological way to handle sadness. We get hugs, we get nurture. And then once that bond happens, the sadness and grief goes away. And so it's a different approach to resolving it with the child than trying to convince the child that they're being psychologically controlled by the parent. And the final little piece I want to cover here is that the pathological parent has damaged self-structure. That's what it's called, COHA, self-structure. And it's damaged. And so it doesn't cope very well with challenging situations. So what they do is they import an outside person to serve as their regulatory object and keep them stable. And during marriage, that was you. Once you're gone, that's the child who's brought in to keep the parent stable. And the child doesn't really have a choice in this. When the parent presents as vulnerable, and the Machiavelli manipulation of the child and all the stuff that happens with the pathological parent, the child is pretty much going to be captured by this parent and their manipulations. Where the child is that they're a good child. They love their mom or dad, this pathological parent, and that parent needs them because they're collapsing. You don't need them as much because you're handling things okay. You're a normal, healthy person. They need me more. And so the child is doing what a good child should be doing. They're taking care of their parent who needs them. The problem is that's a role reversal. That's messed up, and that's really problematic for the child. So as the adults, we need to come in and separate that and make sure that the child doesn't have to become a regulatory object for a pathological parent. But that's the outside professionals that need to come in and do that and recognize the child's pathology. Now, what the child's self is actually doing for us is it's displaying the symptoms so that we can read the symptoms and identify what's going on. Holy cow, kid, you're collapsing into your parent. No, you don't need to do that. We will take care of your parent. Somebody needs to get in there and take care of the parent. The therapist needs to be triangulated in and get the child triangulated out of taking care of their parent. That's not their job. That's a role reversal on that. But it's up to us to read the signals. If we don't properly read the signals, the child will keep emitting higher and higher levels of symptomatic behavior, saying, look, these things are really, really serious over here with all my brain and my emotions and stuff. Will somebody get over here and fix this? The problem is these stupid, ignorant mental health people don't know what's going on. They believe the shared delusion, or they don't respond to it, recognizing it. And so they don't fix anything. They don't diagnose it. They don't protect the child, and boundaries of competence, a whole lot of nightmare issues with the professionals. It's not up to the targeted parent to know what the pathology is or know what the treatment is. That's up to the professionals. It's not the job of a parent to know the pathology and its treatment. It's not the job of the parent to fix this particular pathology. We've got a child abuse by a narcissistic borderline dark parent. That's the professional's job to come in and conduct a proper risk assessment and identify, diagnose the child abuse and protect the child, identify and diagnose the spousal abuse and protect the spouse. That's the professional's job. Unfortunately, they are failing massively in their obligations to the parents, the children, and the court. And as a result, it puts you parents in the position where you have to know the pathology, you have to know its treatment, you have to explain it to your doctors, and fight about it in the courts to try to get an appropriate treatment plan. We're in the process. We'll see what we can do about getting you appropriate mental health services at some point. But until that happens, um, we we cannot ask your child to expose their authenticity until we can first protect them from the withering psychological retaliation they would face from the pathological parent. So until we can protect the child, we can't ask the child to expose their vulnerability or their authenticity. And so if we ask the child to bond to the normal range targeted parent while they're still being psychologically abused by the other parent, we'll just expose the child to more psychological abuse by the pathological parent. So the first thing we need to do is protect the child, and to do that we need an accurate diagnosis based on a proper assessment. I'm going to close with my little language comparison, that we must first diagnose what the pathology is before we know how to treat it. We must first identify what the problem is before we know how to fix it. So diagnosis means identify, pathology means problem, treatment means fix it. And you can use all those words when you want to make a common sense point. Use common sense language. If you want to make a professional point, use a professional language. But I'll speak as a psychologist. You'll hear me speak a lot about the pathology and the pathological parent. Well, you can switch words around and just say, I'm speaking about the problem and the problematic parent. Oh, that sounds a lot more like reasonable than pathology and pathological parent. But it is a problematic parent. It is a pathological parent. And we do need to recognize the severity of the pathology in the parent. 90% of families at post-divorce can solve this without the court's involvement. Only 10% go into high conflict situations. Interesting, about 5% of the population, 6% is diagnosable as narcissistic, 6% is diagnosable as borderline. There's your 12%, 10% who are high conflict parents. Makes total sense. Narcissist, borderline, high conflict, dark personalities. There's your 10% in high conflict. So we have parental personality pathology, attachment trauma, coming into the family courts and distorting the child and the family in characteristic ways that are identifiable by patterns of symptoms. So we need to start assessing, diagnosing, and treating this, and stop fighting around the child. Bring all the fighting to a close. All mental health professionals should be applying exactly the same knowledge to reach exactly the same conclusions and recommendations for treatment. If there's a difference of diagnosis, that's a doctor problem. One of them is incompetent. If there's a difference in diagnosis, based on the same information, all psychologists should be producing the same diagnosis off of things. Otherwise, there's a problem. So with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday. Happy Sunday to all of you, and we'll chat next week. Bye-bye.